The day began like any other, with people waking up, stretching their arms, and stepping into routines that felt familiar and safe. The sun rose gently, casting a soft glow across buildings, roads, and fields. No one imagined that within hours, everything they knew would change. Life was ordinary, peaceful, and steady. Children prepared for school, workers hurried toward buses and trains, and families shared quiet breakfasts before starting their day. Nothing in the air gave even the slightest hint of the storm that was coming. Across the world, scientists in different places noticed something unusual. Screens that normally displayed predictable patterns were suddenly filled with strange signals. Lines of data jumped in ways they had never seen before. At first, most of them thought it was a technical glitch, maybe an error, maybe a satellite malfunctioning. But the signals kept coming sharp, rhythmic, and growing stronger. A few researchers felt a sinking feeling in their stomachs, as if their instincts were warning them that something wasn't right. They tried to alert their supervisors, but the higher authorities gave simple, calm answers. Perhaps it was just interference. Perhaps it was nothing serious. But the signals did not stop scientists from different. Continents began sending emergency emails, phone calls, and messages to each other. They compared waveforms and quickly realized they were identical, as if coming from a single source. Something big was approaching Earth, something far beyond anything human technology could produce. Some experts suggested that it might be a natural cosmic event, while others believed it could be something artificial. But no one wanted to jump to conclusions. Still, a nervous tension spread across labs and research centers. By midday, the sky in different regions began to behave strangely. Birds flew in erratic patterns. Animals that usually stayed near forests came unusually close to human settlements, as if seeking shelter. Some people noticed the air felt heavier, almost as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Parents picking up children felt the unusual stillness around them. Drivers on the highway looked up and wondered why the sky seemed dimmer, even though the sun was shining. In a global communications center, a small team watched sensors flash bright red. Something enormous had entered Earth's outer atmosphere. Satellite cameras struggled to focus on the dark shapes gliding through space with unusual precision. They weren't falling like rocks or debris. They were moving smoothly, controlled, intentional. The team reported the sighting to world leaders, and within minutes, emergency meetings began, but the world was already out of time. Without warning, power grids in several major cities flickered, then shut down completely. Lights, phones, trains, everything went dark. People looked around in confusion, unaware that the blackout wasn't a technical failure, but the first sign of something far worse. In homes, televisions went blank. In hospitals, backup generators kicked in as doctors tried to calm patients. In offices, workers stared at dead screens, confused by the sudden silence. Moments later, the sky filled with a deep, vibrating hum. It wasn't loud enough to hurt, but strong enough that people could feel it in their chests. They looked upward, shielding their eyes from a bright glow that slowly expanded above them. At first, many assumed it might be some kind of test aircraft or a strange weather event. But when the shapes became clear, panic followed. Large objects, dark and metallic, broke through the clouds. They moved with impossible speed, tilting and rotating with unnatural smoothness. People screamed and ran, trying to find shelter, but they had no idea where safety was. The objects hovered silently, as though watching the world below with cold curiosity. Then everything happened at once. A beam of blinding light shot downward, but it wasn't like the explosions shown in movies. There was no loud blast, no fire raining across the sky. Instead, buildings simply collapsed in silence, as if their foundation had vanished. Roads cracked open, vehicles slid into the ground, and smoke rose in thick waves. People tried to escape, but every direction seemed dangerous. The objects moved again, spreading across the sky, releasing waves of energy that shut down communications across entire regions. In control rooms, military officers tried to coordinate responses, but their screens went dark, radios went silent, and satellites stopped transmitting. They attempted to launch defensive systems, but the signals never reached their targets. Moments later, defensive command centers completely lost contact with one another, leaving officers standing helplessly over inactive equipment. All around the world, ordinary people tried to make sense of the chaos. Families huddled together in basements. Travelers looked for ways to get home, but found roads blocked and communication tools useless. In crowded streets, strangers tried to help one another escape falling debris. A quiet fear settled in everyone's hearts, the kind that freezes thoughts and steals breath. A young mechanic working in a small shop stepped outside and saw the sky glowing in eerie color he had never seen before. He dropped his tools as the ground beneath him trembled. Not knowing what else to do, he ran to the nearest shelter with a group of people who had gathered in confusion. None of them knew each other, but they stayed close, as if their shared fear connected them. In the dim shelter, they listened to distant rumbles and wondered whether they would survive. A teacher, who had been heading home, stopped on the sidewalk and stared at the horizon as towers of smoke rose into the sky. Children around her cried, and she tried to comfort them, though her hands were shaking. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to stay calm for their sake. She led them into a nearby store, asked the shopkeeper for help, and together they tried to keep the children safe. A scientist who had first detected the strange signals earlier that morning watched from his research center rooftop as the sky tore open with streaks of glowing energy. He felt sick, realizing that his warnings had come too late. He had spent his life studying space, searching for signs of life beyond Earth, but he had never imagined anything like this. He whispered a quiet apology to the sky, though he didn't know who he was apologizing to, or why. While chaos spread, the world's leaders tried to calm the public, but their messages failed to transmit. Broadcasting stations went offline, emergency sirens malfunctioned, and global communication systems collapsed. People were left alone with their fear, their questions, and the sound of destruction echoing from every direction. Hours passed, but the assault didn't stop. Waves of energy struck regions one by one, disabling everything in their path. Some people fled to higher ground. Others hid in tunnels or underground facilities. A few brave individuals attempted to record what they saw, using old cameras and spare batteries since modern devices had failed. The footage showed massive shadows moving through smoke-filled skies, leaving behind trails of dust and silence. By evening, the world felt unrecognizable. Streets that once held life and laughter were empty. Buildings lay broken. Air that once carried the sound of traffic and conversation now carried only distant rumbles. People who managed to survive the first wave of destruction gathered in groups, sharing whatever food and water they had. Some cried quietly. Others stared blankly, unable to process the reality around them. In one underground shelter, a man whispered that maybe this was the end of everything. But another person shook their head, insisting that humanity always finds a way to survive. Even in the darkest moments, hope never completely disappears. The truth was that no one knew what would happen next. The world was in shock, and silence fell across cities that had once been full of noise and energy. Far away, deep inside a hidden research station, a few scientists still monitored the strange signals. Their equipment flickered, barely functioning, but enough to reveal something unusual. The energy waves striking Earth were causing strange reactions in the planet itself. Temperature shifts, magnetic pulses, and seismic patterns began changing rapidly. It was as if Earth was waking up in response to the attacks, but that discovery would come later. For now, people were just trying to survive the night, unaware that their planet was preparing to fight back in ways they could never imagine. The world had been attacked without mercy, but the story was only beginning. And even though fear filled the air, a small spark of hope still lived in the hearts of those who survived. They didn't know how, but they believed that somehow Earth would not give up so easily. The morning after the first attacks felt unreal. The world that had once been alive with movement and sound now lay eerily silent. Cities that had been bustling with life only a day ago were reduced to ruins. Skyscrapers had crumbled into jagged shapes of metal and concrete. Streets were filled with dust and debris. The few who had survived wandered through the wreckage, their eyes wide with shock, trying to understand what had happened. Some tried to call their loved ones, but phones remained dead, their screens black and unresponsive. For the first time in generations, people realized they were completely cut off, not only from communication, but also from any sense of security got in towns on the outskirts of the largest cities. Survivors huddled together in homes and shelters. They shared small portions of food and water, even though it was unclear how long they would last. Fear hung over them like a heavy cloud, pressing them down with every passing moment. People whispered about the attacks, describing the shapes they had seen in the sky, the strange hums that had vibrated through their chests, and the silence that had followed the chaos. Some cried for lost friends and family. Others simply sat in quiet disbelief, staring at walls or floors, unable to speak. Military forces had tried to organize a response, but the attacks had left them paralyzed. Command centers were destroyed, radar systems were offline, and communication lines were severed. Soldiers stood in empty streets, their weapons useless against an enemy they could not see or understand. Armored vehicles were abandoned, half buried in rubble, their engines silent. Airplanes that had been scrambled never returned. The people of Earth were facing a force unlike any they had encountered before. And for the first time, they truly understood how powerless they were in some rural areas. Life moved more slowly, and the devastation was less immediate. Farmers and villagers awoke to the strange sound of distant explosions, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Smoke rose from far-off cities, carried by the wind over fields and forests. Animals ran wild, sensing the change in the environment. Crops were trampled as livestock fled in panic. People tried to gather their families and move to safer locations, but the world felt unpredictable. Even the sky was unfamiliar, tinged with colors that made the sun seem weak and strange. Among the survivors, small acts of kindness began to emerge. Strangers shared food, led others to safer shelters, or comforted frightened children. One woman, carrying a small child, helped an elderly man to his feet and guided him through rubble to a makeshift basement. A group of neighbors banded together to clear debris from a street, trying to create a path to safety. Even in the midst of destruction, humanity's instinct to care for one another refused to fade. These small moments became the threads that held people together, offering comfort when hope seemed impossible. Meanwhile, scientists and researchers who had survived the first wave were struggling to make sense of the enemy. Their labs had been partially destroyed, but some equipment had survived. They pored over the strange signals that had arrived in the hours before the attack, trying to understand who or what had come to Earth. Calculations showed that these objects were unlike anything ever seen in human history. Their speed, precision, and resilience were beyond comprehension. Conventional weapons had no effect. Attempts to study them through satellite images revealed nothing useful, as the machines appeared to deflect or absorb attacks without damage. Despite the destruction, people tried to maintain routines, even in small ways. Families gathered what remained of their belongings and set up temporary shelters in basements, tunnels, or abandoned buildings. They searched for water and food, often helping neighbors along the way. Children were frightened, asking questions adults could not answer. People shared stories from the day before, trying to piece together a narrative that made sense of the chaos. These small efforts to normalize life, however fragile, gave a sense of control amid the overwhelming uncertainty. The attacks were not over. In some regions, the strange objects returned, moving quickly and silently across the sky. They unleashed waves of energy that flattened structures, burned forests, and split roads. Lightning-like beams cut through towns, leaving behind scorched earth. People ran for their lives, dodging falling debris and collapsing walls. The chaos was unlike anything the world had ever seen, leaving survivors struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of destruction. Yet in the shadows of these ruins, a few pockets of humanity began to organize. Survivors formed small groups, pooling resources and sharing knowledge of the terrain. People with knowledge of medicine, mechanics, and survival became vital, helping others to navigate the ruins and stay alive. A former firefighter led a group through the rubble, showing them how to avoid weakened buildings. A teacher helped children stay calm, reading stories aloud in the dim light of a basement. Even in despair, human ingenuity and courage became tools for survival. Stories of resilience spread quickly among survivors. One man carried a neighbor's young child for miles through rubble-filled streets to reach a safer area. A woman, separated from her family, guided several lost children to shelter, refusing to leave them behind. These small acts, though overshadowed by destruction, created a sense of community that gave people the will to keep going. The realization that even in the worst circumstances, they were not entirely alone became a source of quiet strength. At the same time, scientists noticed another pattern emerging. The attacks seemed to affect the planet itself. Earth began reacting in ways that were impossible to predict. Tides shifted violently, rivers overflowed their banks, and weather patterns became erratic. Storms appeared without warning, forming enormous clouds and sending lightning streaking across already damaged landscapes. Seismic activity increased in areas that had been stable for centuries. The planet itself was stirring, responding to the violence in its own mysterious way. In one partially destroyed laboratory, a scientist noted the sudden rise in seismic energy. He tracked unusual magnetic disturbances, realizing that the attacks were not only destructive to human life, but were somehow interacting with the planet's natural systems. It was as if Earth itself was becoming aware, reacting to the assaults. While the world around them was in chaos, these researchers saw the first signs that survival might still be possible. If they could understand Earth's reactions, they could potentially find a way to fight back. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on survivors was immense. Sleep became impossible for many, and nightmares haunted those who managed to rest. People questioned why this was happening and whether anyone would survive. Grief, fear, and uncertainty dominated every conversation. Families who had lost homes and loved ones struggled to maintain hope. Some began to accept that life, as they knew it might be gone forever. The shock and trauma were as dangerous as the destruction itself, weakening bodies and minds. But they also created a resilience that slowly hardened in those who refused to give in. Communication, or the lack of it, added to the confusion. People wandered in search of news, only to find radio stations offline, internet servers destroyed, and satellite signals gone. Rumors spread quickly, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely false. Stories of people trapped, of rescue attempts, of miraculous escapes circulated from group to group. These stories became lifelines, giving people a sense of connection to a world that now seemed to exist only in fragments. As days passed, survivors realized that mobility was essential. Staying in one place too long meant exposure to unpredictable dangers. Some took to traveling by foot, navigating streets filled with collapsed buildings and unstable terrain. Others moved through forests and fields, searching for untouched areas that could offer temporary refuge. Along the way, they encountered signs of destruction, burned-out vehicles, toppled trees, and strange tracks in the ground that suggested the presence of machines moving methodically through the land. Despite the despair, a few individuals began documenting what they had seen. Using old cameras, notebooks, or even sketches, they recorded the devastation, the movements of the objects, and the reactions of people around them. These records became vital for understanding what had happened and for planning any future resistance. People began to realize that memory, storytelling, and observation could become tools of survival. What was recorded today could save lives tomorrow. By the end of the first week after the attacks, humanity had settled into a fragile rhythm. Survivors scavenged for necessities, avoided areas of extreme danger, and shared knowledge of safe routes and hidden shelters. Communities were small, but connected by cooperation and care. People learned to trust one another quickly, for survival required it. Human life had become a careful balance of vigilance, ingenuity, and empathy. Yet the world was far from safe. The attackers remained present, unpredictable, and unrelenting. Their purpose was unknown, their power overwhelming, and the damage they had caused irreversible in many areas. Still, in the quiet moments between attacks, humanity began to adapt. The survivors who had once felt helpless were learning to survive, to work together, and to endure. Deep underground, the first hints of hope began to take shape. Some of the surviving scientists had managed to restore partial communication between labs. They compared notes on the strange signals, the energy read. In the days following the first attacks, the world was not only broken, but strangely alive in ways that no one could have predicted. While humans struggled to survive on the surface, a small group of scientists and researchers began noticing something unusual beneath the ruins. The ground itself was moving, not violently, but deliberately, as if responding to the chaos above. Sensors in partially working labs showed patterns of energy, magnetic shifts, and seismic activity that had no natural explanation. It was as though the planet itself was aware of what was happening, reacting to the attacks in a way that humans could not fully understand. The scientists were both terrified and fascinated. Some thought it was impossible. Earth, a living planet reacting to human and alien activity, almost sounded like a story from a book. But the data was clear. Patterns in seismic waves were not random. Volcanoes that had been dormant for centuries showed signs of awakening. Rivers, lakes, and tides began shifting in unexpected ways. Even the atmosphere seemed to pulse, reacting to the energy waves that had struck the surface. One researcher whispered that the planet was fighting back, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, on the surface, survivors continued to struggle. Small groups moved cautiously through ruined streets, scavenging what they could from collapsed buildings and abandoned vehicles. Some had begun to notice strange occurrences. Rubble moved in ways that seemed impossible. Fires extinguished themselves suddenly, and areas that should have been dangerous were untouched, almost protected. People whispered about luck, about miracles, but the scientists knew there's more than that. Earth itself was beginning to influence events. One man, who had survived the collapse of his neighborhood, spent days wandering toward higher ground. He noticed cracks in the earth opening beneath his feet, but they were not random. He could almost feel a rhythm to the shifts, as if the planet was speaking in a language he could not yet understand. When he reached a hilltop, he saw a group of survivors struggling to escape a partially destroyed bridge. Without thinking, he ran toward them, guiding them along a path that seemed safer than it should have been. Later, when they looked back, they realized the bridge had collapsed moments after they crossed. They didn't know it, but Earth had helped them survive. In underground shelters, researchers shared their discoveries. They pieced together data from different regions, tracking energy patterns that coincided with the attacks. Every time the invaders unleashed destructive waves, the planet responded. Earth's crust vibrated, water systems shifted, and atmospheric pressure changed. Even the magnetic field seemed to pulse in reaction. It was as if the planet had a mind of its own, and it was learning, adapting to the new threat. Survivors who had learned to pay attention to small signs began to notice patterns too. Birds and animals, which had fled during the first attacks, now moved in unusual formations, sometimes guiding humans away from danger. Weather systems, once chaotic, began showing localized patterns that could be anticipated. In some areas, forests seemed to shelter those who took refuge within them. People began to talk about the planet as if it were alive, a silent guardian quietly defending those who remained. The scientists realized that if they could understand Earth's reactions, they might find a way to amplify them. They began experimenting with ways to detect energy flows, measure seismic activity, and track atmospheric changes. They worked in shifts, risking their lives to stay connected to partially functioning labs, sometimes crawling through rubble to reach equipment that had survived. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and frustrating, but hope drove them forward. Every small discovery felt like a step toward survival. In one city, a group of survivors had gathered in a partially intact building overlooking a river. They had lost their homes, their families, and nearly all of their belongings. Yet they continued to move forward, scavenging, sharing food, and protecting each other. One young woman noticed that the river's flow was changing in response to the attacks. When machines struck the nearby streets, the river's waters rose and diverted the debris, creating a temporary barrier that kept them safe. She pointed it out to the group, and together they realized that the planet's responses could be used to their advantage. Even if they did not fully understand how it worked, across the world, similar incidents were reported. Trees shifted slightly to block debris, sudden gusts of wind diverted flames from burning buildings, and tremors caused collapsing structures to fall in ways that spared those nearby. These small miracles were a sign that humanity was not entirely alone in the fight. While the invaders' power was overwhelming, Earth had its own ways of defending life, and those who paid attention could survive longer than expected. The scientists also discovered that the attacks had weaknesses. While the invaders' machines were almost indestructible to human weapons, they were affected by natural disturbances. Vibrations from earthquakes caused structural malfunctions. Strong storms disrupted their energy flows. Magnetic shifts interfered with their control systems. Every time the planet reacted, the invaders' forces were pushed back, even if only slightly. Slowly, a plan began to form. If humans could learn to guide Earth's natural defenses, they might be able to create pockets of safety, and perhaps even mount a counterattack. Meanwhile, survivors adapted in other ways. They began to move in patterns that seemed to take advantage of the planet's protective reactions. Groups avoided areas where danger seemed concentrated and gravitated toward areas where small, natural shifts had offered protection before. They shared stories of miraculous survival, noticing signs in the sky, earth, and water that indicated when it was safe to move or when danger was approaching. This became a new kind of knowledge, passed from person to person, like a secret map of survival. Despite these glimmers of hope, life remained perilous. The invaders' attacks continued with relentless precision. Buildings fell, roads split, and energy beams struck without warning. Each day brought a new challenge, and every night survivors wondered if they would see the morning. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear threatened to overwhelm them. Yet even in the darkest moments, small acts of courage persisted. People carried the injured, comforted the frightened, and shared the little they had. Humanity's determination to survive was unbroken, even against a force that seemed unstoppable. In one remote research facility, a team of scientists made a breakthrough. They discovered that Earth's reactions were not random, but seemed to be responding to specific energy patterns emitted by the invaders. If they could understand these patterns, they could predict and perhaps even direct the planet's natural responses. It was a dangerous idea, but the possibility of survival was worth the risk. They began designing experiments to test the limits of Earth's reactions, carefully measuring energy flows, seismic vibrations, and atmospheric disturbances dot back on the surface. Survivors noticed that areas where the planet had intervened often became centers of refuge. People gathered in abandoned parks, forests, and hills where small natural barriers had protected them from the worst attacks. These places became temporary communities where knowledge was shared and small networks of safety grew. People learned to observe signs, trust instincts, and rely on both human cooperation and the subtle guidance of the world around them. The psychological impact of realizing that Earth was fighting alongside them was profound. Fear was still present, but it was now mixed with a fragile hope. Survivors felt a connection to something larger than themselves, a quiet force that could not be destroyed. Children slept more easily in these areas, guided by instinctive understanding of safety. Adults began to plan, even in small ways, imagining a future beyond the destruction. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the attacks began, survival seemed possible. As the days passed, the researchers' understanding grew. They began to communicate with small survivor groups, sharing insights on where the planet's reactions were strongest and where it was safe to move. Simple instructions, passed hand to hand or shouted across streets, saved lives. Gradually, a network of cooperation formed between humans and the natural forces that were responding to the attacks. It was a delicate balance, requiring careful observation and trust, but it gave people a chance. In quiet moments, survivors reflected on what had changed. The world they had known was gone, but something new had emerged. They were no longer alone in their struggle. Earth itself had become a protector, reacting to the threat in ways humans could not fully understand, but could learn to respect. And while the invaders still loomed, their power was no longer absolute. There was now a chance to fight back, to survive, and to find hope in a world that had once seemed lost forever. Even as destruction continued in distant cities and unseen places, those who observed, learned, and adapted began to thrive in small ways. Every successful escape, every moment of survival, reinforced a new understanding. Life persisted not because the attacks had stopped, but because the planet and its people had begun to work together. The bond between humanity and the Earth had been awakened by catastrophe, and it was this bond that offered the first real hope for the future. The survivors' resilience, combined with the planet's mysterious responses, created a fragile but growing. The days that followed brought a strange and terrifying rhythm to life. The attacks had slowed, but had not stopped. Survivors who had once wandered aimlessly now moved with purpose, guided by the subtle cues of the planet itself. Trees, hills, rivers, and even the patterns of wind seemed to signal where it was safer to go. People began to notice that Earth's reactions were not random. They were precise, almost intentional, as if the world itself was choosing to protect certain areas while leaving others exposed. It was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that survival depended on paying attention to something larger than themselves. Groups of survivors formed makeshift communities in areas that had benefited from Earth's protective interventions. Forests that had withstood the initial attacks became sanctuaries. Hills that diverted debris and tremors became gathering points. People brought what they could salvage from the ruins of their old lives: water, food, blankets, and pooled them together. Strangers became family in a way that felt natural, almost necessary. Every day, they watched the skies and the ground, learning to read the subtle signals of the world around them. Children, too young to understand the full scale of the disaster, began to sense danger instinctively. They ran when the wind shifted suddenly, hid when trees shook without reason, and pointed out unusual movements in the debris. In these small ways, life adapted, even as destruction loomed. Meanwhile, the alien forces continued their assaults. Their machines moved with precision, spreading across cities, forests, and plains. They unleashed waves of energy that ripped through buildings, shattered roads, and burned everything in their path. Yet Earth's defenses grew stronger with each attack. Lightning storms erupted, striking machines from above, while tremors collapsed structures that had been used as foundations. Rivers swelled, flooding areas where enemy machines had landed. Forests seemed to shift, opening paths for humans while blocking the progress of the attackers. It was not a perfect defense, many had already been lost, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Survivors who had begun observing these patterns found themselves in a new role. They became guides, teaching others how to move, when to take shelter, and where Earth's protective reactions were strongest. One man led a group of villagers through a series of hills and valleys, showing them how to avoid unstable ground. A woman directed children through a forest where trees had fallen in a way that shielded them from attacks. The knowledge passed from person to person became as vital as food or water, and the survivors realized that understanding the world around them could save their lives. In the partially restored research facility, scientists worked tirelessly. They had started to detect correlations between the invaders' energy attacks and the planet's responses. When a massive beam struck a city, for instance, they observed that seismic activity would increase minutes later in a distant region. Magnetic fields would shift. Lightning storms would form in specific locations. Slowly, patterns emerged. The team realized that if they could predict where the planet would respond next, they could direct survivors to safety and perhaps even plan countermeasures. To test their theories. They set up small monitoring stations in surviving areas. Volunteers risked their lives to place sensors in forests, hills, and valleys. These devices measured vibrations in the earth, changes in magnetic fields, and shifts in temperature and pressure. Every small reading added to a growing map of Earth's reactions. The team worked in shifts, often going without sleep, knowing that their research could save countless lives. They understood that while human weapons could not defeat the invaders, Earth itself might be powerful enough to turn the tide. On the surface, survival remained difficult. Food and clean water were scarce, and the constant threat of attacks kept everyone on edge. Yet people adapted. They scavenged from abandoned buildings, shared supplies, and created hidden caches to ensure they had reserves. Children helped by carrying small items, fetching water, or alerting adults to dangers. Every member of a group had a role, no matter how small. These adaptations were not just practical, they strengthened the bonds between survivors, creating trust that became essential for life in a broken world. The invaders themselves seemed to notice Earth's responses, though humans could not understand why. Machines moved cautiously, avoiding areas where the planet had intervened, or altering their paths when tremors shifted the ground beneath them. Energy beams that had once struck without fail now missed their targets more frequently. The alien forces were adapting, but slowly. Every day, Earth's natural defenses grew stronger, more unpredictable, and more effective at countering the attacks. In one ruined city, a group of survivors took refuge in an old library. They had lost almost everything else, but had found shelter among the thick walls and sturdy structure. From their vantage point, they could observe both the destruction and the planet's reactions. When a beam struck a nearby street, a sudden tremor caused a wall to collapse in a way that blocked the path of the machines. The survivors gasped in amazement, realizing that the Earth had saved them once again. They began to map these occurrences, noting which areas had been protected and which had been destroyed. Every detail became important. a guide to survival in a world that was both familiar and alien, at the same time got communication among humans, though still limited, improved in small ways. Survivors used signals, notes, and runners to share information about safe areas and the movements of both enemy machines and the planet's reactions. Networks of cooperation began to emerge, forming a delicate system of support that spanned forests, hills, and valleys. People who had been strangers only days before were now part of a coordinated effort to survive, relying on observation, instinct, and shared knowledge. The psychological impact of seeing Earth fight back was profound. Fear remained, but it was tempered with awe. People began to feel a connection to the world that was deeper than ever before. They understood that their survival depended not only on their own actions, but on paying attention to the subtle ways the planet responded to danger. Children who had once been terrified began to trust the signs around them. Adults found courage in the knowledge that they were not entirely alone, that Earth itself was defending them in ways humans could not fully comprehend. In the laboratory, the scientists' work continued to grow more ambitious. They began designing controlled experiments to see if human intervention could amplify the planet's defenses. Small controlled disturbances, such as redirecting water or creating vibrations in specific areas, were tested to see how Earth would respond. Each experiment was risky, but the team believed that if humans could work with the planet instead of relying solely on weapons, survival might become possible. Every small success fueled their determination, giving them hope that they could one day fight back rather than just hide. Across the scattered remnants of civilization, people adapted in countless other ways. Those living near forests learned to use natural cover, moving silently among trees and underbrush to avoid detection. In towns, survivors created signals to warn others of approaching danger. Communities developed routines to gather food, water, and firewood while remaining alert to sudden attacks. The constant tension was exhausting, yet people found resilience they had never known before. The planet's subtle interventions became guides, helping them navigate a world that had been transformed into a battlefield. Even in places where the attacks were severe, small signs of life persisted. Plants began to regrow in areas that had been scorched. Animals returned, carefully testing the safety of their surroundings. Rivers and streams that had been diverted began to settle into new paths. The natural world, scarred by destruction, was slowly adapting. Humans who observed these changes felt a growing sense of partnership with the planet, realizing that survival was not about domination, but cooperation. The invaders, though still powerful, were beginning to encounter unexpected resistance. Earth's defenses, combined with the growing knowledge of survivors, created obstacles the machines had not anticipated. Vibrations, magnetic shifts, and sudden storms disrupted their operations. They avoided certain areas, rerouted their energy beams, and paused when the ground beneath them became unstable. Each day, humans and the planet together chipped away at the invaders' control, even in small, incremental ways. By the end of the 4th week since the first attacks, the survivors had formed a fragile but growing system of defense. Observing the planet, predicting its reactions, and sharing knowledge had become a daily routine. People were no longer simply hiding, they were learning, adapting, and surviving with purpose. They had discovered that life was not just about endurance, but about observation, cooperation, and understanding the subtle ways the world itself responded to danger. Hope, once almost extinct, began to grow. People realized that Earth was not indifferent. It was alive, aware, and capable of defending those who respected it. Survivors who once feared every sound, movement, and shadow now recognized patterns that guided them. Children ran through forests. Adults coordinated movements through hills, and small communities grew stronger with each passing day. The realization that they were not alone that the planet itself had become an ally, gave people courage and determination. And while the invaders remain, the days had grown long and tense. Survivors who had once hidden in fear now moved with caution and purpose, always alert to the planet's subtle signs. But despite the protective patterns Earth had revealed, the enemy was still relentless. The invaders' machines were more organized now, adapting to Earth's responses and forcing humans to be even more careful. The skies were no longer just a backdrop. They had become a battlefield where beams of energy could strike without warning, and the ground itself could shift unexpectedly. Every day was a test of patience, courage, and attention to detail. Small groups of survivors became remarkably skilled at reading the land. They knew which forests could hide them from energy beams, which hills would shield them from falling debris, and which rivers were safest to cross. Guides emerged naturally, people who understood the patterns and instincts that the planet displayed. One man led a group across a series of hills, showing them which paths were stable and which could collapse at any moment. Another survivor taught children to sense subtle vibrations in the ground, a skill that would save them more than once. These lessons were life-saving, passed quietly from person to person, building a network of survival knowledge that extended farther than any military plan could. The invaders launched a massive assault one morning, moving in coordinated waves. Their machines spread across a wide area, striking simultaneously at several pockets of survivors. The ground shook violently, sending debris flying. Beams of energy tore through the remains of abandoned cities, forests, and open plains. Survivors scattered, seeking cover wherever they could find it. Fear and adrenaline combined in every heartbeat as people ran, ducked, and climbed, trying to stay alive while the planet reacted in unexpected ways. Earth's response was swift and forceful. Tremors split the ground beneath the invaders, toppling structures and burying machines under rubble. Rivers surged, flooding the paths that the enemy had taken. Lightning streaked across the skies, striking with precision at the machine's central points, temporarily disabling them. Volcanoes that had been dormant for centuries erupted, sending clouds of ash and molten rock into the air, forcing enemy forces to retreat. Survivors watched in awe as the planet fought back, revealing a strength they had never imagined. The attacks were devastating, yet Earth itself seemed to shield life in subtle, almost invisible ways, giving people the chance to escape and regroup. In one valley, a group of survivors huddled behind a thick grove of trees. They had lost everything: their homes, their friends, their sense of security, but they were alive. The tremors caused by the attacks shifted the ground around them, creating a natural barricade that kept the enemy at bay. Children clung to adults, wide-eyed but quiet, as the trees swayed and branches fell to the ground, protecting them from falling debris. Adults whispered to one another, realizing that survival depended on more than just hiding. It depended on understanding how Earth was responding and moving in harmony with it. While the planet's reactions created opportunities, they were unpredictable. A path that had been safe yesterday could collapse today. A river that had diverted debris could suddenly flood a previously stable area. Survivors learned quickly that survival required constant attention and flexibility. Groups moved together, communicating silently through gestures, listening to subtle shifts in wind and ground, and watching for changes in the sky. Trust between members became essential. A single mistake could be fatal. The scientists who had survived the early attacks worked tirelessly to understand Earth's reactions in greater detail. They had developed small monitoring stations in forests, hills, and valleys, observing vibrations, magnetic fields, and atmospheric changes. By studying the correlation between the invaders' attacks and the planet's responses, they began to predict where Earth's defenses would be strongest. They sent this information to survivor groups whenever possible, giving them a chance to anticipate danger and find safe zones. Their work was slow, exhausting, and dangerous, but it was vital. Each successful prediction saved lives and strengthened the survivors' hope. As the attacks continued, humans and Earth seemed to develop an unspoken coordination. Survivors who understood the planet's signs moved in ways that complemented its defenses. Tremors blocked the paths of machines, floods diverted energy beams, and forests protected those who took cover among their trees. Even small actions by humans could amplify Earth's responses, whether intentionally or unknowingly. Moving debris to redirect water, creating small disturbances in certain areas, or guiding groups through safe paths all contributed to the planet's effectiveness in defending life. Despite the constant danger, survivors adapted remarkably. Children learned to remain quiet when tremors shook the ground, to follow adults' gestures, and to notice small environmental clues. Adults scavenged efficiently, carrying food, water, and supplies while remaining aware of threats above and below. Communities established routines that maximized survival while minimizing risk, such as traveling in groups, using forests and hills for cover, and moving only when Earth's signals indicated it was safer. One survivor recalled the first moment she realized Earth was fighting alongside them. A massive energy beam had struck a nearby street, flattening everything in its path. But just as the beam touched the ground, the earth beneath it split, diverting the force and creating a barrier that protected a group of survivors hiding nearby. The woman had been terrified one moment and awed the next. She shared the story with others, and soon more people began to notice similar events. What had once seemed random now felt like intentional defense, a reason to keep moving, observing, and trusting. The invaders, though intelligent and relentless, were now facing unexpected obstacles. Machines that had once destroyed anything in their path found themselves blocked, diverted, or incapacitated by natural phenomena. Their attacks became less effective in areas where survivors had learned to read the signs and work with Earth. While humans could not destroy the invaders, they could survive and even disrupt their operations by cooperating with the planet's reactions. This fragile advantage allowed small communities to endure, regroup, and maintain hope in a world that had been shattered. In the most dangerous zones, where attacks were constant, survivors relied on both instinct and observation. Hills that had once seemed ordinary could become shields, forests could provide cover, and rivers could act as natural barriers. Every movement had to be deliberate. Every decision mattered. People learned to trust not just one another, but the subtle signs of the world around them. The bond between humans and the planet grew stronger, forming a partnership that neither the invaders nor time could break. Scientists continued to experiment cautiously. They observed that small disturbances in the Earth, such as minor vibrations or carefully redirected water, could enhance Earth's defensive responses. These findings suggested that humans could play an active role in guiding the planet's strength. Each experiment was risky, but survivors were willing to take the chance. If successful, they could create safe zones, direct attacks away from populated areas, and potentially even prepare for a larger strategy to confront the invaders more effectively. On the front lines of survival, ordinary acts became extraordinary. One man guided a group of elderly survivors across a collapsing bridge, timing every step to match the Earth's subtle shifts. Another woman led children through a forest where fallen trees blocked enemy machines, using Earth's own defense as protection. These actions were not heroic in the traditional sense. They were practical, instinctive, and necessary. Yet together, they represented humanity's growing ability to endure, to adapt, and to coordinate with the living world around them. By the end of this intense period, survivors had learned critical truths. Life was no longer just about hiding. It was about reading the signs, anticipating danger, and cooperating with the planet's reactions. Human courage, resourcefulness, and observation became just as important as Earth's defenses. Together, they created a fragile but growing network of safety. The invaders were still present, still a threat, and still powerful. But humans were no longer powerless. They had discovered that the planet itself could fight, shield, and guide them. They had found ways to move with purpose, predict danger, and survive when destruction seemed inevitable. Small victories, such as escaping an attack or discovering a safe route, became sources of hope. Communities grew stronger. Skills were shared. Trust became a vital resource, just as essential as food or water. In one forested valley, a group of survivors gathered for the first time to plan an extended movement. Using maps, observations, and the insights provided by the scientists, they charted a path that maximized Earth's protective influence. Every hill, river, and grove was considered. Every decision was informed by both human knowledge and the subtle signs of the planet. They moved as one unit, careful, quiet, and coordinated, understanding that survival depended on cooperation with forces greater than themselves. Through these coordinated efforts, survivors realized that hope was no longer just a fragile thought, it was a strategy. Life persisted not because the invaders had weakened, but because humans had learned to move, observe, and adapt in partnership with Earth itself. The bond between life and planet had grown unbreakable. The world had changed completely. Cities that had once thrived were now ruins. Forests were scarred by fire and falling debris, and rivers had shifted courses in strange, unpredictable ways. Yet life persisted. Survivors had learned to read the planet like a map, noticing the smallest signs in the wind, the ground, and the water. Earth itself had become a teacher, guiding them to safety, protecting them when danger seemed unavoidable, and showing that life, in some form, could endure even in the face of unimaginable destruction. Small communities of survivors had grown stronger, not just in numbers, but in coordination and understanding. People moved together in groups, carefully planning every step, every movement. Paths that had once been deadly were now routes of safety, because humans had learned to cooperate with the subtle shifts of the land. Children ran quietly through forests. Adults watched for tremors and changes in the air, and everyone relied on a shared sense of awareness that was born out of necessity. Every success, every escape, strengthened bonds that had once seemed impossible to form. The invaders' machines continued their attacks, but their power was no longer absolute. Tremors, floods, shifting trees, and lightning had become natural obstacles that disrupted their operations. Areas that had once been destroyed were now being reclaimed by Earth's defenses. A group of survivors watched from a hilltop as energy beams struck the ground, only to be diverted by a sudden surge in the river below. Machines toppled or were trapped in mud and debris, forced to retreat. It was proof that the planet, though not perfect, was actively protecting life. Humans began to understand that they did not have to confront the enemy directly to survive. They had a partner in Earth itself. In one valley, a team of survivors worked with the knowledge shared by the scientists. They had begun to experiment cautiously, moving water to create small floods, shifting rocks to redirect energy flows, and clearing debris to guide the planet's responses. Each intervention was careful, measured, and deliberate. When a massive wave of destruction approached, the valley responded almost as if it were alive. Trees shifted to block debris, rivers rose to divert energy beams, and the ground trembled just enough to disorient the invaders' machines. The humans in that valley realized that they were no longer just surviving, they were cooperating with the planet in ways that increased their chances of enduring. The scientists had become more confident. Their monitoring stations, once simple tools for observation, now allowed them to predict patterns in Earth's reactions. They could identify areas where energy would strike, where tremors would occur, and where rivers might rise. Using this knowledge, They communicated with scattered survivor groups, offering guidance on safe zones and escape routes. Life was still dangerous, but with Earth's protection and the scientists' insights, survival became more than just luck. It became a careful strategy. Even as hope grew, the psychological toll of the attacks remained immense. Many survivors had lost loved ones. Children were growing up in fear and chaos. Nights were often sleepless, haunted by memories of destruction. Yet amidst the trauma, humanity's resilience shone through. People comforted one another, shared stories of survival, and celebrated small victories. Every successful escape, every day lived without injury, became a triumph in a world that had once seemed lost. One remarkable incident reinforced the bond between humans and the planet. A group of survivors had been trapped in a narrow canyon when the invaders launched a sudden strike. The machines moved with terrifying precision, cutting off every possible route. Panic spread, and hope seemed to vanish. But then the ground shifted beneath the machines, sending them tumbling into a collapsed ravine. A sudden storm formed, its winds forcing energy beams off course. The survivors, guided by instinct and the subtle signals of the land, escaped safely. Later, they realized that the planet had intervened directly. That moment became a symbol of hope, proving that even in the worst circumstances, Earth would fight for life. As weeks passed, humans began to move more strategically. They no longer simply ran or hid. They planned, observed, and adapted in harmony with the world around them. Paths through forests, hills, and valleys were charted with care, and small groups moved together like living patterns, following the guidance of the land. They learned to notice the signs of danger before it arrived, reading shifts in wind, tremors in the ground, and changes in the flow of water. Their survival depended not only on their own courage, but on understanding Earth's intentions, which had become clearer over time. The invaders' attacks grew more complex, yet Earth's defenses became stronger in response. Tremors split roads, diverting the machines. Floods rerouted rivers, and storms struck with precision, disabling or destroying enemy machinery. Survivors observed these events and began to take action, using small interventions to guide the planet's power. It was a delicate balance. One misstep could be fatal, but the coordination between humans and Earth continued to improve. Every success reinforced a shared understanding. Survival was not just about avoiding danger, but about cooperating with the living planet that surrounded them. In one makeshift shelter, a group of survivors huddled together to share knowledge. Children were taught how to sense vibrations in the ground, to watch the movement of animals, and to notice subtle changes in the air. Adults discussed patterns they had observed, marking safe routes and predicting potential hazards. Skills were shared openly, and stories of survival became lessons. The community functioned like a living organism, each member contributing to the safety of the whole. These shared efforts became a source of strength, showing that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, life could adapt, endure, and protect itself. Meanwhile, the scientists discovered something remarkable. Earth's responses were not only defensive but adaptive. The planet seemed to learn from each attack, adjusting its reactions to provide better protection in future events. Areas that had once been vulnerable became safer, rivers diverted in more precise ways, and storms formed in predictable patterns to counter the enemy. The researchers realized that the planet was actively learning, almost as if it were conscious. For the first time, humans felt that they were not alone, not just in surviving, but in fighting back. This realization gave hope to the scattered survivors. They began moving with purpose, organizing groups based on the scientists' guidance and Earth's subtle signs. They experimented carefully with interventions, guiding rivers, clearing debris, and creating small disturbances to amplify the planet's defenses. Each successful attempt reinforced their confidence. Survival was no longer passive. It had become a shared effort between humans and the living world. Even the youngest survivors learned to adapt. Children became alert to environmental signs, noticing shifts in wind, changes in water flow, and vibrations in the earth. They warned others, helping guide groups away from danger. Adults learned to trust these instincts, realizing that the smallest observation could save lives. Together, humans and Earth formed a partnership that grew stronger every day, creating a fragile but resilient network of life. Despite the continuing attacks, communities began to thrive in small ways. Gardens were planted in protected areas, water sources were shared responsibly, and safe shelters were established in valleys, forests, and hills. Survivors began to think about the future, imagining a world where life could persist even after the invaders were gone. The bond between humans and Earth had grown into a force that could endure destruction, adapt to danger, and protect life in ways that no weapon could achieve. The invaders' machines, powerful as they were, could not predict the combined strength of humanity and the planet. Tremors, floods, shifting forests, and storms disrupted their attacks, forcing them to retreat or adapt in ways they had not before. Survivors began to realize that victory might not come from direct confrontation, but from endurance, observation, and cooperation. Each day, Earth's defenses grew stronger, guided by instinct, energy, and perhaps a conscious will to protect life got in one extraordinary moment. A massive assault struck a valley where a large group of survivors had gathered. The machines moved in perfect formation, cutting off escape routes. Panic spread, but the survivors moved calmly, guided by the subtle cues of the land. A sudden tremor split the ground beneath the machines. Rivers surged to block their paths, and lightning struck with devastating precision. The invaders' forces were thrown into chaos, giving the humans the chance to escape and regroup. The valley became a symbol of hope-proof that cooperation with the planet could save lives even in the most extreme danger. As the attacks continued, survivors learned to plan not just for escape, but for sustained survival. They moved in groups, relied on Earth signals, and shared knowledge freely. The planet itself seemed to guide them, reinforcing paths of safety and amplifying human interventions. Communities grew stronger, children learned quickly, and adults taught patience, observation, and strategy. Every day was a test, but humans were no longer passive. They had become active participants in their own survival. In the end, humanity had discovered a remarkable truth. Earth was alive, aware, and capable of defending life. The invaders' attacks were devastating, but they could not destroy the bond that had formed between humans and the planet. Survival,